Okay, so after years and years of waiting, we finally have the final regulations for the Secure 2.0 Act, which means that inheriting an IRA just got a little bit easier because we now have clarity on a lot of the rules that we didn't. So in this video, I'm going to break down everything that you need to know about inheriting an IRA, and we're going to answer the one question that everybody that we've talked to has. Do you need to take required minimum distributions from your inherited IRA? Hey everybody, I'm Jonathan Rankin, the founder and CEO of Theorem Wealth. We're a retirement planning focused wealth management firm, and I've been helping people plan and execute their retirement goals for going on 20 years now. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. And if you've been here before, welcome back. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be breaking down everything that you need to know about the final regulations to the Secure 2.0 Act. I mean, hey, it was only 260 pages, so just a light breeze of a read. And we're going to get to the number one question that we always get. Are annual distributions required during the 10-year rule? But you got to stay tuned because we're going to get there in just a bit. Now, we got to take a step back, and I know we've covered this before on the channel, but it's important to break down everything about inheriting an IRA because there are still a lot of questions that people have, and we need to take a step back and go through what type of beneficiary are you? As a reminder, there are two types of beneficiaries for an inherited IRA. You can either be an eligible beneficiary or a non-eligible beneficiary. Now, there are other types like charities or trusts, but today we're going to focus on individuals. So as an individual, you're either an eligible or you're a non-eligible designated beneficiary. So how do you know whether you're an eligible beneficiary or you're a non-eligible? Well, if you meet any of these following criteria, you are an eligible beneficiary. So if you're a surviving spouse, if you're disabled, if you're chronically ill, if you're a person that is less than 10 years younger than the original account owner. So think of, a sibling or a cousin or maybe even a best friend. If you're less than 10 years younger than the original account owner, you're an eligible beneficiary. If you're a minor child, there was always speculation and questions about what does it mean to reach the age of majority, and we finally have an answer. So in the new regulations, a child reaches the age of majority when they turn 21. This is good. We no longer have to consider what state the child lives in, whether the child's in school or not, because there was a lot of nuances with the previous ruling. And before we jump into the RMD requirements, there are a number of major updates that you really need to be aware of. We're going to start with inheriting a retirement account that was at an employer, meaning it was a 401k or 403b, but it was not in an IRA prior to death. And if this is the scenario where, let's say it was in a 401k, and the only reason why you're an eligible beneficiary is because you are disabled or chronically ill, well, now you actually have to show proof of that disability or chronic illness to the plan administrator by October 31st of the year following the year that the employee passed away. So if an employee was working at a major corporation, they had a 401k and passed away, you inherited that account and you are either disabled or chronically ill, you have to show proof. And get this, if you've inherited an account in 2020, 2021, 2022, or 2023, and the only reason you're an eligible designated beneficiary is because of being disabled or chronically ill, then you actually have to show the relevant documentation to the plan administrator by October 31st of 2025. This is just wild. There are no documentation requirements for IRAs, but for employer plans like a 401k, there are. Now, they didn't specifically say what you need to do if the assets were rolled from that employer plan into an IRA after passing. Because I would imagine that a lot of people that inherit a 401k roll those funds into an IRA. They didn't provide any sort of guidance on who needs that documentation now, but I would recommend providing documentation to the original plan administrator instead of the custodian that you might have moved the funds to. Just to be safe, it's always better to be safe than sorry. Now, the next update that I want to cover is for minor children of the decedent to be an eligible beneficiary. They are now including stepchildren, even if they're not adopted, which was a big change because there was a lot of confusion on whether or not stepchildren were considered an eligible beneficiary before. And the next regulation is around the required minimum distribution in the year that the decedent passed away. Because before there was a lot of confusion if you inherited an account, and let's say you inherit it with a number of other people. So you've got a fraction of that account. There was always some confusion on how much and who needs to take the required minimum distribution in the year that the decedent passed away. The new rule states that as long as the total RMD amount is withdrawn collectively by the beneficiaries, it doesn't have to be taken proportionally. So if there are multiple beneficiaries, I know it can get extremely confusing when calculating that RMD in the year of death, and hopefully this helps simplify that. So one of the questions I get all the time from people is, what happens if I inherited an account from somebody who's already inherited the account? So we finally get some clarity on what happens to a successor beneficiary. So what happens if an eligible beneficiary passes away? Well, if an eligible designated beneficiary dies before they've withdrawn all of the money, then the 10-year rule kicks back in for their beneficiary. This means that the remaining money must be fully distributed within 10 years after the eligible beneficiary's death. Now, another big change by the IRS is the separate account rule can now apply to trusts as long as some very easy conditions are met. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's look at this example. So imagine that there's a trust that's the beneficiary, but in that trust, 50% of that trust belongs to the spouse, 25% to a healthy child, and 25% is designated to go to charity. Well, that single trust can be named the beneficiary now, as long as it splits into sub-trusts right away, and each beneficiary uses their own post-death rules, which we'll get to in just a bit. Now, the last update that I'll touch on before going through the RMD requirements is the penalty. Now, before the Secure Act, there was a 50% penalty if you missed an RMD. So it's a huge penalty. Even if you missed it by a day, you owed 50% of whatever that RMD was. That has now been reduced down to 25%, and it can actually be waived or reduced. So if you can show the IRS that you missed the RMD because of a reasonable error and you're working to fix it, then the IRS might actually waive that 25% penalty. Now, if it was just a timing issue and you just missed it, you just forgot to take the RMD, and you correct that shortfall by taking out the missed amount and report it to the IRS within a specific period, which they're calling the correction window, then the extra tax is reduced to 10% instead of 25%. Now, the correction window ends at the earliest of either of these days, when the IRS sends a notice about deficiency, or when the IRS assesses the tax, or the last day of the second year that you missed the RMD. This means that even if you miss taking the required amount from a retirement plan, you would still face penalties, but they're going to be a lot more reduced than what they used to be. All right, so now let's touch on the rules for required minimum distributions, the reason why everybody has so much confusion and questions around inheriting an IRA. So if you're an eligible beneficiary and the decedent died prior to the RBD, now the RBD is the required beginning date. So if you're ever looking this up online and you see the term RBD, they're talking about the required beginning date. That's the date in which required minimum distributions are set to begin. So if you are an eligible designated beneficiary and the decedent died prior to being forced to take RMDs, then you can stretch the IRA over the course of your lifetime. You could also abide by the 10-year rule, but most people would actually just stretch over their lifetime. If the decedent died on or after the RBD, then you can also stretch the IRA over the course of your lifetime. Now, if you were a non-eligible beneficiary, so if you're a non-spouse and you do not fall into any of the categories of an eligible beneficiary, this is where things always get confusing. For non-eligible beneficiaries, where the decedent died prior to the RBD, then you must follow the 10-year rule. Now, the 10-year rule states that you have to have depleted the account within 10 years. Now, if the decedent died on or after the RBD, this is where things get a little confusing. So the decedent died after they were taking required minimum distributions, then you still have to follow the 10-year rule, but you also must stretch out the RMDs as well. So to answer the big question, are annual distributions required during the 10-year rule? The answer, and that we now have clarity, is yes, if the death occurred on or after required minimum distributions were scheduled to begin. Now, this rule won't actually begin to apply until next year, so 2025. So to be clear, no RMDs during the 10-year rule from 2021 through 2024. But just because you don't have to take an RMD, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't, because waiting until the end could cause a lot more taxes than anticipated or than needed, just because you are now taking out larger amounts down the road and possibly putting yourself into a much higher tax bracket. Now, if the owner died before the RBD, then you just have to empty the account within 10 years. Now, if the owner died on or after the RBD, you can stretch those RMDs in years 1 through 9 and empty everything in the 10th and final year. Now, as I mentioned, the final regulations won't apply until 2025, so no RMDs during the 10-year rule from 2021 through 2024, but prior years will still count as part of that 10-year period. So for example, if you inherited an IRA from an 80-year-old in 2021, and there were no RMDs in 2022, 2023, or 2024, you have to take annual RMDs starting in 2025 through 2030, and you must empty the account in 2031. I know these are a lot of changes, and there are a lot of pages and a lot of rules to go through, and it can still be really confusing. But if you have questions or you need help, please use the link below and schedule some time with a member of our team. We'd be happy to help give you clarity when inheriting an IRA. Now, if you're looking for ways to reduce your taxes in retirement, then make sure you check out this video coming up next, where I share with you 10 ways you can do just that. I'll see you there.